We're going to go ahead and get started with our worship service. But before we do, I wanted to open the service with a short verse found in Jeremiah 17. It said, "Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It has no worries in a year of drought, and it never fails to bear fruit." And then further down, there was a devotion that went along with it, and I highlighted this portion. It says, "Life is no life that cannot live through hardship." And I think it is because that tree trusts in the Lord. This is an image. You are the tree. If you trust in the Lord, you will have no worries in a year of drought because your confidence is in the Lord. So rise to your feet. We're going to start with Through the Fire. Let's go ahead and pray before we begin. God, we bring these songs to you, and we want them to change our hearts and our minds, because even in a few hours we get crusted over. We want to have soft hearts, God. We want to be kind, like Jesus. Help us, Lord. Amen. children home. God leads his dear children home. God leads his dear children home. There Peter's going to lead us in that.
Haven't done this in a while, so let's sing together out unto the Lord. One thing remains higher than the mountains. Just keep on worshiping the Lord the way you have been. Lift up your voices. Higher than the mountains and amen. Sing with me. Stronger than the power of the grave. Constant in the trial and the change. One thing remains. One thing. One thing remains. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love. Let's lift up our voices. And on and on and on and on it goes. As it overwhelms and satisfies my soul. And I never ever have to be afraid. One thing remains. One thing remains. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love, death and your love, sing with me. In death, in life, I'm confident and covered by the power of your great love. My day's paid. My debt is paid. There's nothing that can separate my heart from your great love. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Let's sing that again. Your love never fails. One last time. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. Alright, we're going to pray together. Ask you to bow your heads, close your eyes as the band plays quietly in the background. Let's go to the Lord right now, at this moment. Lord, we humbly come before you, and again we ask, as we ask every Sunday, to help us, aid us by your Spirit to forget, even for the next hour or so, all the things that would distract us. Lord, supernaturally help us so that we can be open, our minds can be open, our ears can be open, our hearts can be open to you. Lord, this morning we ask that you would please continue to speak to us through the pastor, his words. Let your Spirit flow through his mouth and into our ears, our hearts. We thank you for the opportunity to be here, to worship you, to give back, and more importantly, Lord, just to listen and accept what you would have for us. Thank you for the privilege, and please bless our time here together. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, folks. You may be seated.
We are in our series called The Good Work, and there's some notes. If you know, there's no fill in the blank this week. So, but anyway, there's notes to follow. And I just, honestly, I listed probably maybe 6 or 7 or 8 statements that are great nuggets of truth when facing opposition. Let me just say this right before we jump in. I know all of you face opposition. I know that for sure. If you have breath in your body, I know you face opposition. And I think some of the problem with facing opposition, I think we write it off as coincidence. The only reason I know that is because I do that myself. I write it off as coincidence. I write it off as, that is really not a satanic attack, and I'm not saying everything is, but because sometimes just bad behavior on my part is just bad behavior on my part. And I really like to blame Satan for bad behavior on my part. So, yes, and it's an easy way you don't have to own up. So, Satan gets blamed for a lot. Now, I understand he is driving a lot. But sometimes I just flat out have a bad attitude. And I like to blame Satan for my bad attitude. And it very well might be him. But I have to own up because I know better. Most of the time I know better and I just let it fly anyways. But anyway, so we blame a lot of things on just coincidence and the opposition is real. And if you want to do something for the Lord, anything for the Lord, even as small as this, please hear this, even as small as this, a man wants to start praying in his home with his family at dinner time. You say, that is so elementary. You'd think it would be, but it's not. If a man wants to start, if a woman wants to start praying in their home with their kids, I believe there's potential for opposition. Someone, even one of your children, will pass gas at the table while you're praying, and then the other kids just can't help themselves but laugh their head off at someone passing gas during the prayer. And then something else happens. Someone spills a water glass while you're praying. You just cannot help it. You just cannot help it be disrupted if you want to start even something as simple as start praying at your table. And then you're dealing with all the inner talk and self-talk about just praying, let alone doing something magnificent for the Lord, for just starting that. So anyways, we write a lot off that it's not it's not a spiritual battle, but a lot of things are spiritual battles and things that go on in our own head. Anyways, we are in a series called The Good Work. It's about Nehemiah and a story of him going back and building the wall. But part 3 today is called this. It's called Standing Strong in the Face of Opposition. Standing strong in the face of opposition. I hope today's message will be an encouragement to you. Standing strong in the face of opposition. But some things I do know about going forward in this message. I know some things will be difficult as we talk about these things. But please know this. Anytime that God leads you or prompts you to do something meaningful for Him, even as small as starting prayer, you say, no, I think that's a good idea. I think that's a Christian thing to do, to honor God. Just mention God before we partake in His blessing. Even as small as that, you could face opposition. You say, well, all I wanted to do was just start reading Bible stories, short Bible stories to our children at bedtime. And almost every night they're sick. Almost every night there's an issue. Almost every night they laugh so hard at someone's funny joke, they can't even get it together enough to listen to my Bible story. So I think I'm not going to do it anymore. I think I'm not going to do it anymore. Opposition. Small as that. Small as that. So, anytime God leads your heart, leads you or prompts you to do something meaningful, to right a wrong, big deal. To right a wrong, to do something generous, you would say, well, how could you run into opposition if you do something generous? It's someone has you in their sights, and then they start saying, oh, they just gave that for show. To show. So they would be like a big man or a big woman in the eyes of the church. They gave that, and even if you didn't make known, if someone gave the church this or that, I could see how Satan could turn that around and punch you right in the nose with that. Because he hates you. That's why. You say, well, why does he hate me? Because he hated your Lord. And if they persecuted me, Jesus said, guess what? They'll persecute you. Period. That's it. They'll persecute you. It's just that simple. So, to right a wrong or do something generous, you could be persecuted for it. Opposition could show up. Something that helps others. Anything that helps others, opposition could show up. Unfortunately, when you do something, anything for the Lord, you could face opposition. Not always, but you could face it. Even obstacles and spiritual resistance, you could face that. Things that will slow down the work God has placed in your heart to do. Anything. Anything's better than nothing in Satan's eyes that will slow down your work and make it more difficult for you to continue. Anything! It could just be a bad attitude out of someone that you work with. Anything to slow down your work for God. Anything! Adam and Eve were serving God in the garden. Satan came to interfere. He even took the form of a snake. Like Halloween. Took the form of a snake. Moses had Pharaoh as opposition. David had Goliath as opposition. In the New Testament, Jesus had Herod, the Pharisees, and even other religious leaders as opposition. Jesus! Then he could have pitched all their heads off. But he had opposition in his life. In the New Testament, Jesus had opposition. You think about the Batman. He had the Joker. You think about that one, how serious that one is. Nehemiah, our man, had at least two people, Sanballat and Tobiah. Sanballat and Tobiah. I wanted to just give you a word of backstory here for those that maybe weren't caught up for this. But Nehemiah was an ordinary guy. He was a cupbearer for King Artaxerxes of Persia. He was a cupbearer, drank the king's wine before he drank it himself. So before the king had a taste of it. Nehemiah heard this, heard about his people that were 1,000 miles away. He heard about his people 1,000 miles away back in Jerusalem. He heard this, that the city, the walls, the gates, the economy, everything was a mess. All destroyed by the Babylonians, and they could not put it together. They could not, just because there was about 50,000 released to go back, and they could not put it together, how to rebuild, and they were in a mess trying to rebuild. And he got word back to Nehemiah, who was serving the king as a cupbearer, that this is just a mess. A mess back in Jerusalem, them trying to rebuild. Nehemiah's heart was broken, and he said this, someone has to do something about it. You gotta be kidding, we're here and our lives are pretty good. Someone has to go and do something about it. And I think he said that long and hard enough that it said it might as well be me. It might as well be me. He seeks God, approaches the king, and asks the king to help him rebuild Jerusalem. It's a great story about an ordinary guy that had passion. Just an ordinary guy that had passion to do something bigger than himself. An ordinary guy. This guy's a cupbearer, and he's going back and lead a general contracting job for a city. An ordinary guy with passion that wanted to do something for God. Back in Jerusalem, he begins to rebuild the gates. And there were loads of gates. If you've read anything about Nehemiah, there were loads of gates. You can read about the building project in Nehemiah. Actually, it's a good read in chapter 3 about the building project and all they did and all that they put up and all they accomplished. It's a good read to just see how detailed this building project was. He led loads of people to rebuild the sheep gate, the fish gate, the valley gate, the horse gate, the water gate, the dung gate. I'd like to have a house close to the dung gate. But folks, these are real gates, and they're massive gates to the city. Real gates. And they were rebuilding all these because it's foolish to rebuild the walls and not have the gates rebuilt. So they rebuilt these kind of primarily. They rebuilt these in Nehemiah chapter 3. Nehemiah was inspiring other ordinary people to help build the wall. He was inspiring these people to help build the wall. I'm a pastor. I don't have any city gate skills. I don't. And many of you don't have any city gate skills. These folks weren't masons or carpenters. They were goldsmiths. I'm just getting it out of the context of Scripture. They were goldsmiths, merchants, and perfume makers. These were the construction crew. It sounds kind of discouraging to me. Try that one on for size. Get a perfume maker to build one of the city gates. It sounds like so ridiculous. It would be awful fancy. Maybe the gate would smell very, very good. Because I imagine he was concerned about smells, and maybe they put him on the dung gate to clean that baby up a little bit. But nonetheless, they asked a perfume maker to help rebuild the gate. Finally, they are seeing some progress. They are. They're seeing some progress with these gates. Gates are standing up. Walls are being put back from just piles of rubble and stone. Walls are being rebuilt and re-cemented and restacked and fortified. Folks are beginning to think, just maybe, we can do this. Maybe. Hey, Tammy, if we turn that heat down before I just fall down. So, anyways, just maybe we can do this. Did you ever think that about a project you got at home? Just maybe I can do this. It's dangerous when I tell Donna that. Just maybe we can do this. Because she just keeps pushing and pushing and pushing beyond my skills. Way beyond my skills. And so anyways, but if you've done that in your own home or your own life, it's difficult. It's difficult. But just maybe you think, maybe we can do this. Maybe we can do this. I've already started projects and I had to call someone that I knew something about it. And say, this is what I've done. They say, well, why did you do that? Those are very discouraging words to me. Just because I did. And but this is what many know. Many know this already, that when the work is up and going, many times opposition shows up. In some way, shape, or form, opposition shows up. The moment the work begins to glorify God, if it's a work like that, then opposition shows up. In some way, shape, or form, opposition shows up. You can set your watch or your calendar to know that some sort of opposition, many, many times, will show up, and it takes all kinds of forms. Because you're really, when you're doing something for God, you're ready for that guy in the red suit with a tail and a pitchfork to come marching in. You're ready for him. So he never shows up like that. He never wears his suit. He wears normal suits. He wears normal clothes. He wears clothes like Satan does, like a workman, like he's coming to help you. And you think, this is what you can do for me. And you don't know it, but this is what you could say. This is what you can do for me, Satan. Watch out for Satan. Watch out for Satan. Because I know he hates this work. Watch out for Satan. So, anyways, Nehemiah, in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1, let's begin to see this picture here. It says this: when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. Sanballat was ticked off because the wall was beginning to be rebuilt and the gates were being put back together. He ridiculed the Jews. And in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing?" I looked up in Greek, a Hebrew dictionary, and it was talking about, what are those wilted, dead flowers doing? Wilted, dead flowers. And maybe that wouldn't insult you, but they knew the score there. And that's what Sanballat was saying. What are those wilted, dead flowers trying to do here? They're all lined up. They're all lined up, and the enemy saw people with little to no resource. They saw them trying to rebuild walls. Are you kidding me? A perfume maker in charge of a construction project. They saw that. But this is what they didn't see, Sanballat and Tobiah. This is what they did not see. They did not see their spiritual resources. They saw that they were ill-equipped to do this, but they did not see that. In fact, that's where many make the mistake. You don't see the spiritual resources, and you don't see God smack dab in the middle of the project. We just see that they got an old rusty wheelbarrow and a shovel with half a handle broke down. That's what we see, and we don't see God in the middle of it all. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? It says in verse 1 through 3. Will they restore the wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back from life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What are they building? Even a fox could climb up on that wall, on it, and break it down, and break the stones down. Just a fox walking on. That's how lame it looks." So what do we see? We see that the build begins. The opposition shows up. Sanballat and Tobiah and lots of others with them. They were just the mouthpieces. Do you ever see on Fox, not Fox News, but on the news in general, do you ever see there's people riding in the streets and there's usually 2 or 3 or 4 mouthpieces? Big mouthpieces. I mean, just standing in opposition. Well, these are the mouthpieces here. Sanballat and Tobiah. When the build began. Maybe this happened to you. Maybe this has happened to you. You were moved to step up. Moved to step up and do something. Do something maybe that you saw a need, and God has spoken to your heart to step up and do something for Him. And then out of the blue, for whatever reason, you never did a thing to these people, you find opposition coming your way. From people that you thought, honestly, that you thought were okay. Opposition. It could be as simple as this. You've been out of church for about a year, and you decided to come back. Finally, you made this major decision to get your keister out of bed and drag it back to church. You made that decision. It's time. I've got to do this. It's big, but I've got to do this. I'm not joking. If you've been out of church a year, that decision is big. That's almost like building a Jerusalem gate. You're going to go back, and you're on your way to church, and you get into a family fight. You're going to church, the house of God, and you get into a family fight, and you yourself drop the F-bomb about 10 times because you're so ticked off. You're going to the house of God after all. How do you feel after you do that? You're in the house of God and the F-bomb has been dropped all over your car in front of about everybody. Maybe you said this. That's it. God is leading us to become debt-free. I am tired of this debt. It's drowning us. It keeps nipping at my feet. Debt-free. That week, your car sounds funny, and the garage tells you your transmission is on its last leg. And that's about a $1,500 bill. You just decided to get debt-free. What is going on there? Opposition. It could be that you finally begin serving in the children's ministry. You are going to pour your life that God has given you into these children's lives. You're going to pour your life into them. And the first Sunday you show up, one of the little kids throws up Fruity Pebbles all over you. And you just bought that new shirt. Because you were going to rock the class with that new shirt. And you look good in it. Now you don't look so good. Those Fruity Pebbles are smeared all over you. Listen. Opposition shows up in all kind of ways. Maybe you told someone close to you that God is leading you to do this or that. And they say, you know, friend, that's about as dumb an idea as I have ever heard in my entire life. Now, I love you and all. And I'm telling you that as a friend. That is so stupid. Or they just laugh. They just laugh and laugh about your stupid idea. And they just leave you laughing because they can't even talk about it. They're laughing so hard. They asked, why would you do that? Why would you do that? You have no skills. Why would you decide that? Folks, please know, don't ever be surprised whenever you face opposition. Don't ever be surprised, even though we are still surprised when we face opposition. Still surprised, like, what? Anytime you decide to do something for God, you'll face opposition. You take a step of faith and bam, bam, opposition. In your notes, there's a statement. It says, advancement invites opposition. Advancement invites opposition. I love some of these statements that I've read. Advancement invites opposition. What do we know about Satan, our enemy? Well, the devil doesn't bother too much with those that are not a threat. Those that just make a living out of sitting on the couch. He doesn't bother. He doesn't have to. Your full-time job is sitting on the couch. So why would he usher you? Why would he spend and send a couple of, like 4 or 5 demons? Why would he do that? He doesn't need to. That's what the demons do, trying to get you back on the couch. He doesn't need to do that. He doesn't bother with those who are spiritually napping too much. When you decide something has to be done, when you finally decide something has to be done, and it might as well be me, expect spiritual opposition. If comfort and ease is what you want most in this world, then as a Christ follower, do not engage, do not pray, do not serve, do not give, do not care. Don't let your emotions be moved and care about this thing that God has placed on your heart or burdened you with. Because the moment you step out of your comfort zone and seek the God of heaven and follow His lead, the opposition of demons and people will show up. Will show up. Folks, please know, God is calling, and He's still calling. Still this very day, He is calling ordinary people to step up. Ordinary people. He's calling them to step up, to serve, to tithe, to pray, to invite people back to church that are far from God. He wants us to step up and do those things, to show love, not just in church. If this is the only place we show love, oh boy, have we missed it. Missed it. But as the church in this world, He wants us to show love to people that need love shown to them. And when you do, know this, opposition will come. It just will. Opposition will come. You say, well, Pastor, I'm kind of bored in this Christian life. Jump into the work. Jump into the work and see how boring a punch in the head will take. Will come across to you. See how boring that will be. Because that's what we end up getting. We get all kinds of things coming our way. You try and raise your children for the Lord. Try and raise your children for the Lord and watch opposition. You say, well, no, I don't feel any. Your kids are being attacked. Your kids are being attacked in so many ways that we don't even know about. Your kids are being attacked. Listen, critics will come. Opinions that you never even asked for will come your way. Opinions. And I just love you. That's why I'm telling you that. Critics will come. Opinions will come. Nehemiah steps up. He steps up, say, someone has got to help the people. Our kin back in Jerusalem. They said, it might as well be me. Nehemiah steps up. Sanballat and Tobiah begin to tear him down. Tear him down. So how do we respond to critics and haters? How do we respond to critics and haters? The answer is, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you don't. Please hear, most of the time, I say this. Now this is hard on me because I don't mind responding. But I think it's best. Sometimes it's best not to respond to critics and haters. Think about what Nehemiah did. He didn't respond. He didn't answer. He didn't defend. He didn't. He just didn't. Please understand this. Your response isn't going to convert your critics. It's not. Your response is not going to... We'll spend a chunk of time, energy that you could be doing the work, refocused on correcting our critics. It won't convert your critics. Most of the time, this is what response does. It validates our critics. I heard one leader say this as I was reading. One leader said this: when we acknowledge our critics, we actually give them power. When we acknowledge, now that's, honestly, I had to really think about that, because I think even critics sometimes need a punch in the nose. Yeah. But it doesn't help most situations. It just ups their idea to come back at you, and then you got to spend more time and more cleverness, if you have any cleverness in you, to to battle the critics. They're not really that important, the critics. They're not really that important if you don't respond. In fact, things tend to die down if you don't respond. Ignore them and get to the work of God. Folks, it's hard dealing with critics and haters. It is. It's hard dealing with critics and haters. Even more difficult, though, is dealing with people you love. Those are critics and haters. These are people you love now. When people you love bring doubt, bring the doubt. People you love, those closest to you, doubt what you believe God has instructed you to do. I heard one man talk about that this week as I was reading, and he talked about becoming a Christ follower. Said he became a Christ follower at the end of his college years, and he felt the tug of God to jump into ministry. He said, I have lived for Satan, and I have skills galore, and I have lived for Satan. I'm going to use the skills that God has given me to become a pastor. I feel a sense of God calling me to be a pastor. Said he was an excellent business manager, the top of his class in all those things in business management. He told those closest to him that God is pulling at his heart to become a pastor. Most of his peoples said this: you'll do great in business. Are you nuts to waste your skills on a church? Are you nuts? He said it's most difficult when those closest to you doubt your calling and doubt what God is leading you to do, because that hurts worse than your critics and enemies. Those closest to you. Now, listen, it was a little different whenever I started sharing. In fact, I didn't share for a long time that God's dealing in my heart to become a pastor, because I didn't want people laughing at me. I had been so far off the road and into the weeds in my life. Most people I talked to said, yay, do something but be what you were. Anything but be what you were. So they were cheering me on to not go back to the old Kevin Brown, especially my wife. Donna never had a problem wherever I said, I believe God's leading, God's speaking to my heart to go to Bible college. And we had a house, nice just good job. And she said, okay. She said, okay, because she didn't want what she had for years. In fact, she was frightened not to. She told me she was frightened not to get along with God's plan. And I said, what do you think? And she said, yeah, honestly, Kevin, I think that would be a good move. That would be a good move for you, and and I see potential in you. I didn't really see it because I was scared to death. So, but it's the most difficult when those closest to you doubt your calling. Loads of people who feel that God called them even to foster care. Foster care have heard this. What are you doing? You can barely handle those kids you got now. What are you doing adding another one to the mix? Are you crazy to add another? Those are the closest to you sometimes. In your notes, I've said this, I've heard this said. It was good wisdom. It says this: as a leader, I'm not going to let praise get into my head. Those that praise me, I'm not going to let it get into my head, or I'm not going to let criticism get into my heart. It says I want to be moved by God, not by what people think, because you will be up and down. If that's what you're counting on for all that, you'll be up and down. So, this is what Nehemiah knows. He knows that he doesn't answer to his critics. That's what he knows for sure. He doesn't answer to his critics. He knows he answers to God. Notice Nehemiah's prayer in Nehemiah 4, verses 4 through 6. It says, "Hear us, our God. Hear us, our God, for we are despised." He's telling God, oh, God, people hate us. People really hate us. Folks, please know this. It's not what Jesus, I really don't think this is what this kind of prayer Jesus taught. This prayer. And I'm sad that I like it so much. That's a revealer of my heart, maybe. But this is what Nehemiah prays. Nehemiah continues. Nehemiah says this in his prayer. "Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in the hand of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builder." If I could condense that prayer, he's saying, God, get them, God! Get them! Get them. Please punch them in the mouth for us, God. Just please do that. That's what I said. I just can't imagine Jesus telling us to pray that way. So it's a little different, but Nehemiah, that's what he said. Folks, to be honest, I do like that prayer. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I got to own up here. I like that prayer. So anyways, I actually, and then even to fess up even more, I prayed that several times. Prayed that for God to do the WWE on several. Several, yes. So, but notice verse 6. Notice verse 6. It says, "So we rebuild the wall till all of it reached half its height, and the people worked with all their heart." You can accomplish a bunch of things if you work with all your heart. And that's what they did. So in the face of opposition, Nehemiah prayed, and they got back to work. They got back to work. They didn't set up forums for Sanballat and Tobiah. They got back to work. The wall went up because they worked with all their heart. They didn't stop the work and argue. They just worked the work. Work the work. Nehemiah was spiritual and practical. I love this. He prayed as though everything depended on God. He prayed as though everything depended on God and worked as though everything depended on them. Spiritual and practical. Verse 10. In the middle of all the criticism then, it says this in verse 10. "Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall." The wall, he goes, we seem to have worked and it's just endless, and they're giving out. They're giving out. Last week we saw progress. This week, now we see discouragement. And their enemies saw their discouragement. That's the worst. The enemies saw their discouragement, and this happens often with the work of God. You get a bit of progress, and then you get discouragement. A bit of progress, and then discouragement. Then in verse 11, he says this, "Also our enemies said this to us. Before they know it, or see us, we will be right there among them, and we will kill them." That's what their enemies said. We will kill them and put an end to the work. And the Jews who lived by, not only just the enemies, these were the Jews that lived by now, and were offering their brilliant comments. Here, it says, "The Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over." They told us over and over. It seems like almost every other day they showed us to tell us this. Over and over, "Wherever you turn, they will attack us." Wherever you turn. Endless. Folks, we see Nehemiah's people, it's starting to doubt. And the work has to be starting to slow now. So, we are worn out, and people are lining up against us. It says there's really nowhere you can go. That's what the neighborhood said. There's nowhere you can go. Everywhere you turn, they're lining up against you. So, folks, There's spiritual opposition. As we talked about spiritual opposition, we talked about there's external opposition, and then opposition from those closest to me. But the worst, one leader says, and somewhat, this is the worst. The worst kind of opposition that you will receive is when you have internal opposition. Internal opposition, insecurities about what God has led you to do. All the insecurities. Your insecurities rise up and say this. Insecurities rise up and say this. Who do you think you are, Kevin Brown? You are a hillbilly from Bunker Hill in Mount Pleasant. That's all you are. And don't ever forget it. That's all you are. Stop the charade. I have had the voices inside my own head tell me this through the years. Voices rise up against you. Who do you think? You don't have what it takes. You don't. Yes, I do! With God's power, I have what it takes. No, you don't. I think I do! You think wrong. Kevin Brown. And please know that. Please know that. Folks, beware that you don't listen more to those inner insecurities than to who God says that you are. Be very aware of that. Because it'll take you down if you listen too much. It'll take you down. Loads of pastors have left the ministry. Loads of teachers have packed their lesson and run away from ministry. Loads of leaders have left because they listened to their insecure inner voice. They've packed it. They packed up and have gone. Listen, beware you don't listen to to those voices than to who God says that you are. Inner insecurity voices are extremely loud. They're extremely loud, even though no one around you can hear them. They're extremely loud. I've heard them shout in my ears. Heard them shout. Sometimes it's loud, very loud in my own head. In your notes, I've heard this said, and I know this is true. External opposition. Please hear this. External opposition. This is the voices without. External opposition will only be as loud as my internal insecurities allow them to be. Internal insecurities, you and only you can control the volume. You can control the volume. You! You got the knob in your hand. And as loud as you let that be, that's how loud the external voices will be, as much as you let them. Listen, that's why we don't give power to the critical and doubting voices. I think sometimes they're worth looking at and evaluating, but do not give power to them. Watch Nehemiah. He hears them. They are discouraged. They're giving up. And they don't think that things can be done. From here on in, things can't be done. You're up against it, and you think things can't be done. Verse 14, he writes, Nehemiah writes, after I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, to the officials, and to the rest of the people, I said this to them, don't be afraid of these voices. Don't be afraid of Sanballat and Tobiah. The enemies, Sanballat and Tobiah. Don't be afraid of what they say. This is what I said to the nobles and the rest of the people. The leadership. Do not be afraid of these people, of these voices, what they say. Why? Why should we be afraid? They're scary voices. Why? This is why. And Nehemiah says this, remember the Lord who is great and awesome. That's why. That's why. Oh no, I need something more magnificent than that. That's all you need, buddy. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. Nehemiah shifts focus off of himself and the enemies and back on to the Lord. Honestly, if you keep that perspective that the Lord's in your corner, buddy, it will help you stand up in the face of some serious obstacles if you keep that perspective. He's saying that this battle isn't ours. This battle belongs to the Lord. Our God is with us. Our God is for us. He will never leave us or forsake us. That's what Nehemiah was saying. He said, don't be afraid of them. And he said, remember the Lord. Nehemiah remembered, he remembered how he walked in to the king. Walked into the king, and God moved the king's heart. He remembered that. He said, remember the Lord. He said, I remember when these walls were just piles of rock. My first time back, I remember seeing these just magnificent piles over my head of rock. Just rock. No gates, no walls. Just rock. I remember how a perfume maker became a gate builder. I remember that. I remember God is great and awesome. I remember when He led our people out of Egypt. I remember that. He led our people. Oh, people, hear, please hear. Out of the hand of Pharaoh that had a grip on the nation. And no one could do anything about it. And He led us out. Pried those greedy hands of Pharaoh off of us and released us. I remember, he says. I remember when He led us out. I remember when He led us by fire at night and by a cloud during the day. I remember that. I remember when He parted the Red Sea. We thought, that's it. We're finally going to get what's coming to us. The ocean is there, and the army is there, and they have swords, and we're a bunch of people that all we know how to do is lay brick and make brick. And I remember what God did. I remember. I ask you, this is what we don't do many times. I ask you, what do you remember about your life? What do you remember? Where you were and where God picked you out of? And what He has done with your life? What do you remember about your life? And what God has done? Listen, I remember how He loved me and forgave my sin. I remember that quite often. I remember how He came after me and wouldn't give up on my rebellious heart, even though it made me shake. Whenever I would rebel, and I knew, I was raised in a Christian home, so I knew the score. To my disadvantage, I knew the score, but it was really to my advantage. And I used to quake as I willfully sinned against an almighty God. It was torture many times. You say, well, weren't you having fun? Yeah, about half the time. The rest of the time, I knew. Only because my mother reminded me regularly that God will not permit you to live a life of a selfish pig. God will not, you know better, Kevin. And those rang in my ears when I was alone in the car with women. Those things would come to mind, and that's like a mood killer. Or whenever I was chugging them down as fast as I could chug them, I would hear those voices. God would not let you always live like a selfish pig. My mother told me that. many, many times. And that always bothered me. I hated that, really. It ruins the party. And I hated that, but I still plowed through. I still plowed through. And then one day, God finally broke through. I remember that. I remember He saved my marriage. It was hanging by a tiny little thread, and the worst off is, I really didn't care at that point. He saved my marriage. It rocks my world today, how He saved my life and saved my marriage. I think about those faces of my children. I think about those often. Where would it all be if God wouldn't have insisted on my heart? Where would it all be today? And it just makes me cry. I remember how He gave me another chance at life. He gave me another chance at life. What do you remember about God? What do you remember? That's what Nehemiah's saying. I remember. If you just got a small memory, you can remember the hand of God moving in your life. Just a small memory can produce that. I remember Nehemiah in verse 14 says, "Don't be afraid, remember the Lord. He's great and awesome." Then he says this, and this is what I really like too. He says to the people and everybody, to the nobles, "Fight for your families." He said, "Fight for your families, fight for your sons, fight for your daughters, fight for your wives, fight for your homes. If you got anything in you, it's worth fighting for. Fight for all that." That's what Nehemiah told him. I love that. In fact, it makes me want to go get in a fight right now. And I know that's not Christian either. It says, fight for the most precious things in your life. Fight. Fight! Don't go sit on a couch. Get up and fight for what you consider most precious in your life. Because you have an enemy that wants to hold your head under the water till you take your last breath. And give it all up. Fight. Fight. In your notes. In fact, this is the last page. In your notes, the last nugget, one warrior said this, that if I'm not ready to face the opposition for my obedience to God, if I'm not ready to face the opposition for my obedience to God, I'm not ready to be used by God. Because it will kick you right in the teeth. When you decide you want to do something for God, it'll kick you right in the teeth. You're ready to face opposition in your life. Listen, folks, fight for what God has put on your heart. Fight for what God has put on your heart. Let's close with this. In Galatians 6:9, it says this, "Let us not become weary in doing good." King James says, weary in well-doing. It says, "For at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Fight. Fight. Christ follower, stand strong in the face of opposition. Stand strong. It's worth standing for those precious things all around you. That's it. That's part 3. Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much. Honestly, I love that stuff. I love those Old Testament stories where ordinary people, because that's all this guy is, has an opportunity to do the work of God and be able to stand. Otherwise, you can't if you don't get the Lord involved with it. So otherwise, why would you do it if the Lord's not involved with it? So anyways, let's close in prayer. Lord, thank you so much. Thank you so much for Nehemiah's story, that he was an ordinary man, that he just honestly, he was the voice when things, it's clear, Lord, how discouraging things would be. People get tired. There's enemies. Then there's people saying all kinds of things. And it's exhausting. It's discouraging. It's depressing sometimes. Lord, as you've already started with me, it is so worth fighting for the things that you count precious in this life. I count you precious, Lord. I count what you have given me precious. And I count this church and these people precious, Lord. These are worth fighting over. Help us, Lord. I ask you to do that. If there's one here today, Lord, that just they do not know Jesus as their Savior, Lord, today be the day that they would say yes to you, Lord. Yes to you. I ask you, if there's one here today like that, oh, would you encourage their heart to just give me a call this week, or they can even do business by bowing their knee to you, Lord, even today. Please continue to give us strength. Please, Lord, as we think about all those things that are precious to us, they are worth fighting for. Fighting for. Help us to never give up until you, Lord, call us home. Help us to never give up. I ask you to do that. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Folks, that's part 3. Part 4 next week. We will conclude the series next week. God bless you. You are dismissed. Live for Christ this week.